The machines were already being unplugged. The doctors had signed the papers. The billionaire had given his permission through tears he thought no one could see. 47 days. That's how long his son Marcus had been lying in that bed, chest rising and falling only because a machine told it to. No brain activity. No response. No hope. The nurses were saying their quiet goodbyes. And then a 3-year-old girl, the maid's daughter, slipped past everyone, climbed onto the edge of that hospital bed, pressed her tiny lips against the young man's ear, and whispered something. Something no one else in that room could hear. And Marcus opened his eyes. Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive into the story, and I promise you this one is going to reach inside your chest and rearrange something, I want to ask you something first. Where in the world are you watching this right now? Are you in the United States? Maybe curled up on your couch somewhere in Texas or New York or California? Are you watching from the United Kingdom, London, Manchester, somewhere rainy and beautiful? Maybe you're in Canada, wrapping your hands around a warm cup of something and letting the evening settle. Or perhaps you're in Australia, where it's already a completely different time of day, and you found this video anyway because good stories don't care about time zones. Maybe you're watching from India, from a city that never truly sleeps, or from Germany, precise and thoughtful and quietly emotional in the way only Germans can be. Wherever you are, drop your country in the comments right now. Just the name. That's it. Because this story belongs to all of you, and I want to know who's here.
Now,
let me tell you about a billionaire named Richard Hale, a maid named Sophia, and a little girl named Lily, who did what no doctor, no specialist, and no amount of money in the world could do. Let's begin. Richard Hale was not a man who lost things. That was simply not part of his story, not woven into the fabric of who he was or how he moved through the world. He had built his empire from a single room, a converted garage in Charlotte, North Carolina, where at 23 years old, he had slept on a fold-out cot next to a whiteboard covered in calculations that his college professors had told him were ambitious to the point of delusion. He didn't sleep much in those early years. He didn't need to. He was powered by something that doesn't have a clean name. Not just ambition, not just hunger, but a specific kind of fury that comes from being told, repeatedly, that you are dreaming too loudly. By 30, he had proven every one of those professors wrong in a way that was almost poetic in its completeness. By 40, Richard Hale was worth over $2 billion. His company, Hale Technologies, had revolutionized medical imaging software in ways that had, and this was the irony that would come to haunt him, saved thousands of lives. Hospitals across 12 countries used his systems. His name was on a wing of a children's hospital in Boston. He had shaken hands with presidents, sat across dinner tables from kings, and been photographed on the covers of magazines that described him with words like visionary and unstoppable. He was also, in the quiet spaces of his life, profoundly alone. His wife, Elena, had left 7 years earlier. Not dramatically. There were no screaming matches, no thrown dishes, no theatrical exits. She had simply looked at him one Sunday morning across a breakfast table that could seat 20 and said, very calmly, that she felt like she was living next to a monument rather than a man. That she had been trying to reach him for years and kept finding only walls. She wished him well. She meant it. And she left. Richard had responded the way he responded to most personal difficulties, by working harder. His son, Marcus, was 24 at the time our story begins. He had his mother's eyes and his father's mind, which was both a gift and a particular kind of burden. He was brilliant in ways that felt almost accidental, the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself but simply solves things quietly and moves on. He had been studying environmental architecture at a university in Chicago, designing buildings that worked with the earth rather than against it, structures that breathed and adapted and left a lighter mark. It was the kind of work that made Richard privately uncomfortable, not because he didn't respect it, but because he couldn't measure it the same way he measured everything else, and Richard Hale was a man who needed to be able to measure things. Their relationship was careful. That's the kindest word for it. They loved each other in the way of two people who speak slightly different languages and have never quite found the phrase that crosses the gap. Phone calls on birthdays. Dinners at Christmas that were warm, but not quite warm enough. Marcus had stopped asking his father to come see his projects after the third time Richard had canceled at the last minute due to something urgent. Richard had stopped asking Marcus why he'd chosen a field that, in Richard's words, didn't scale. They were in the specific tragedy of fathers and sons, running out of time to figure it out. And then on a Thursday evening in November, Marcus was cycling home from the university library when a delivery truck ran a red light. The driver survived with minor injuries. Marcus did not die, but for 47 days, the difference between that outcome and the one that actually occurred was thin enough to see light through. The diagnosis was a severe traumatic brain injury with what the lead neurologist, a careful, honest man named Dr. Yusuf Patel, described as an extended disorder of consciousness. In plain language, Marcus was there in some technical sense. His heart beat. His lungs processed air. But the part of him that was Marcus, the part that laughed at terrible puns and stayed up until 3 a.m. sketching impossible buildings and called his mother every Sunday without fail, that part was silent. The first week, Richard flew in 3 specialists from Europe. The second week, he had a private medical facility constructed, effectively a hospital room inside his Charlotte estate, staffed around the clock, with monitoring equipment that exceeded what most ICUs could offer. The third week, he stopped sleeping. By week 6, Dr. Patel had sat with Richard in a quiet conference room and used words like diminishing probability and quality of life and the kindness of letting go. Richard had listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table in front of him, perfectly still, the way he sat in board meetings when someone was delivering news he didn't want to hear. He had nodded at appropriate moments. He had thanked the doctor. And then he had gone to the men's room and stood over the sink for 11 minutes, gripping the porcelain, staring at a face he barely recognized. He had never, in his entire life, encountered a problem that money could not at least partially solve. This was the first one, and it was the only problem that had ever truly mattered. Sophia Reyes had been working in the Hale estate for 3 years before Marcus's accident, and in the strange, invisible way of household staff in very wealthy homes, she knew more about Richard Hale than most people who considered themselves as friends. She knew that he drank his coffee black and too hot, and that he always made a second cup that he never finished. She knew that he kept a photograph in the top drawer of his study, face down, always face down, that she had once accidentally seen when she was cleaning. A younger Richard, laughing at something off camera, his arm around a woman who must have been Elena, and a small boy on his shoulders squinting into summer sunlight. She knew that he never played music in the house except on Sunday evenings, when he would sometimes put on old jazz, Miles Davis, mostly, and stand at the window of his study looking out at the garden with an expression that had no business vocabulary to describe it. She was 31 years old, originally from a small city in Guatemala called Quetzaltenango, which she always said in full when people asked because she was quietly, fiercely proud of where she came from. She had come to the United States at 19 with 2 suitcases and an aunt in Charlotte who had promised there was work. There had been. It had been hard. She had done it anyway. She had a daughter named Lily, who was 3 years old and small for her age, and possessed of the particular brand of fearlessness that belongs exclusively to toddlers and people who have simply stopped caring what others think. Lily had dark eyes that missed nothing and a habit of asking questions at maximum volume at the least convenient moments. She had been born, as Sophia sometimes thought of it, already entirely herself, no fumbling toward identity, no uncertainty about what she liked or didn't like or what she thought about things. She had simply arrived in the world and begun operating. Sophia had not planned to bring Lily to work. She had never done it before in 3 years. But on the morning of November's 47th day, her babysitter had called in sick. Her backup babysitter was visiting family in Raleigh, and the third name on her list, a neighbor named Mrs. Donnelly, who sometimes helped in emergencies, did not answer her phone. Sophia had a morning shift she could not miss. Not this week, not with the house in the state it was in, not with Mr. Hale barely leaving Marcus's room, and the household running on the kind of tension that made every surface feel fragile. She had bundled Lily into her coat, packed a small bag with crayons and a juice box and a worn stuffed rabbit named Conejo, and explained very carefully on the drive over that she was to sit quietly, color in her book, and not touch anything. Lily had listened to all of this very seriously, nodded once, and then asked if the big house had a dog. It did not. Lily seemed to find this personally disappointing. Sophia set her daughter up at the kitchen table with her coloring book and went to work. For 2 hours, everything proceeded as planned. Lily colored. Sophia cleaned. The house was quiet in that particular heavy way it had been quiet for weeks. Not peaceful quiet, but held-breath quiet, the kind that presses against your eardrums. And then Sophia heard small footsteps going somewhere they shouldn't. She found Lily standing in the hallway outside Marcus's room, head tilted, looking at the door with an expression of concentrated curiosity. Lily. Sophia's voice was low, urgent. Come away from there, baby. That's not our room. There's someone in there, Lily said. I know. Come on. He's sad. Sophia paused. What? Lily turned and looked at her mother with those dark, too serious eyes. The boy in there. He's sad. He's trying to wake up, and he doesn't know how. Sophia felt something move through her that she could not explain and would never fully be able to explain to anyone later. A chill, but not cold. Something that stood up along her spine and paid attention. Lily, you cannot go in there. I just want to tell him something. You don't know him, baby. Lily looked back at the door. I know he's sad, she said simply, as though this were the only qualification that mattered. And in some fundamental way, it was. Sophia stood in that hallway for a long moment, rational thought wrestling with something older and quieter. She thought about the doctors. She thought about the machines. She thought about the 47 days of silence. And then she thought, what harm is there really in a child's kindness? She opened the door. The room that Richard Hale had built for his son was, objectively speaking, extraordinary. It had been constructed in what had previously been the estate's East Wing guest suite, which was already large. Generous windows, high ceilings, wide plank oak floors that Sophia herself kept polished to a quiet glow. But Richard had not simply placed medical equipment in a nice room and called it done. He had, with the specific desperation of a man who cannot fix a thing but cannot stop trying, attempted to recreate something that felt like Marcus's life. There were bookshelves along one wall, filled with the actual books from Marcus's apartment in Chicago, transported in careful boxes by a personal assistant who had driven up specifically for the task. There were architectural sketches framed and hung, Marcus's own work, the impossible, beautiful buildings that breathed. There was a small Bluetooth speaker on the nightstand, and someone, Sophia suspected it was Richard himself, in the small hours of sleepless nights, had programmed a playlist of the music Marcus loved. Indie folk, some classical, a few old soul records that seemed incongruous until you heard them and understood they weren't incongruous at all. And in the center of all this carefully assembled love was Marcus himself. He was tall. Even lying down you could see that, his father's height, rangy and long-limbed. He had his mother's dark hair and a face that, under different circumstances, would have been described as open, the kind of face that invited conversation. There were no external signs of injury. No casts, no visible wounds. He simply looked asleep, in the profound and ordinary way of a young man who had worked too hard and needed rest, except that he had been asleep for 47 days, and the machines breathing beside him were the only reason the number hadn't stopped counting. Richard was in the chair beside the bed when Sophia pushed the door open. He looked up, and the expression on his face when he registered not Sophia, but the small child holding her hand was not irritation, not the guarded formality he usually wore, but something rawer than that.
Surprise, yes.
But also a kind of brief, helpless openness, as if Lily's presence had momentarily bypassed all his defenses simply by being what it was, a living, healthy, curious child with a stuffed rabbit under one arm and nothing in the world to protect. Mrs. Sophia. His voice was flat from exhaustion. Who is this? I'm so sorry, Mr. Hale. My sitter canceled. This is my daughter, Lily. She won't be any trouble. I just need to, Lily, come on. Sophia reached for her daughter's hand. But Lily wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at Marcus. She had walked 2 steps further into the room without Sophia noticing, and she was looking at the young man in the bed with that focused, tilted head expression that meant she was thinking hard about something. He looks tired, she said. Richard stared at her. He is tired, he said after a moment. And something in his voice broke very slightly on the last word, a hairline fracture in the careful composure that Sophia had watched him maintain for 7 weeks. Can I say something to him? Lily, Sophia began. It's okay. Richard's voice was quiet. He looked, Sophia thought, like a man who had simply run out of reasons to say no to anything. He gestured slightly toward the bed. Go ahead. Lily walked to the bedside with complete seriousness. She was barely tall enough to see over the mattress edge. She stood on her toes, and she looked at Marcus's face for a long moment, studying it the way she studied things she was genuinely interested in, without self-consciousness, without the social awareness that tells most of us to look away from difficult things. And then she leaned in close, so close her lips nearly touched his ear, and she whispered. No one in the room could hear what she said. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, maybe 5. And then she straightened up, tucked Conejo more firmly under her arm, and turned around with a satisfied expression of someone who has accomplished a task. The monitors showed nothing different. Marcus did not move. Richard looked at Sophia with an expression she couldn't read, and Sophia murmured an apology and reached for her daughter, and they were nearly at the door, when the rhythm of the heart monitor changed. Dr. Patel would later describe it, in the careful language of medicine, as a spontaneous emergence from a disorder of consciousness coinciding with, though not necessarily caused by, a period of auditory stimulation. Richard Hale, when asked about it in interviews years later, would simply stop talking for a moment and look somewhere past the interviewer's shoulder before saying, quietly, that some things don't need an explanation.
They just need to be received.
Sophia Reyes, when her daughter asked her about it years later, would say, "You woke him up, baby." And Lily, who by then was old enough to understand what that meant, would just nod, as though this had always seemed reasonable to her. But in the room, in the actual living moment of it, the heart monitor changed rhythm. Not flatlined, not alarmed, just changed, shifted, the way a sleeper's breathing shifts when something has reached them in the deep of a dream and begun pulling them back toward the surface. Sophia stopped walking. Richard stood up from his chair so fast it scraped against the floor. Lily turned back around and looked at Marcus with calm expectation, as though she had been entirely sure this would happen and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Marcus's left hand moved first. Not dramatically, not a lurch or a flail. Just the fingers, closing slightly, like someone reaching for something just beyond the frame of a dream. Then his head turned, a fraction, toward the side of the bed where Lily was standing. And then his eyelids moved. Richard made a sound that Sophia had never heard from a human being before and hoped, for his sake, he would never have to make again. Not because it was terrible, but because it was so completely unguarded, so stripped of every layer of competence and control, that it felt almost too private to witness. It was the sound of a man who had been braced for the worst thing for 47 days suddenly being told the worst thing was not coming. It was relief and terror and love all arriving at the same instant with nowhere to go. Marcus. His voice shook. He was at the bedside in 2 steps, his hand covering his son's hand, his face close. Marcus. I'm here. I'm right here. The eyelids moved again. Slow, like something learning emotion it had temporarily forgotten. Sophia had already pressed the call button. Footsteps were coming from the hallway. The night nurse, alerted, breaking into a run. Lily stood perfectly still at the foot of the bed, watching Marcus with the serene attention of a child who is observing something interesting and important and sees no reason to be afraid of it. Marcus's eyes opened. Not fully, not bright and clear and all at once.
Slowly.
In stages. The way a room fills with light when someone gradually raises the blinds on a winter morning, cautious at first, then more, then all of it. His eyes were dark, like his mother's, and for a moment they moved without focus, traveling across the ceiling, the walls, the window, the shapes of the people in the room.
Lost.
Finding. And then they settled. Not on Richard. Not on the nurse rushing in. Not on Sophia. On Lily. He looked at this small, serious, unknown child standing at the foot of his bed with a stuffed rabbit under her arm, and something in his face softened in a way that defied medical terminology entirely. As if something had come through before he was even fully conscious, some impression left by those 4 or 5 seconds of whispered words, and he already knew this person, in some way he couldn't yet have language for. His lips moved. Dry, cracked, effortful. The nurse was on the other side of the bed now, checking monitors, calling out numbers into a phone. Richard was holding his hand with both of his and saying his name over and over. The room had gone from silence to controlled urgency in 30 seconds flat. But Marcus's lips moved again, and this time, in the hush between all the noise, a sound came out.
Small.
Rough from weeks of disuse. But unmistakable.
Hey, he said.
He was looking at Lily when he said it. And Lily, who had never in her 3 years on Earth learned to be anything other than exactly herself, looked back at him and said clearly, "You finally woke up." Richard laughed. It was a broken, wet, completely undignified laugh that shook his entire body, and Sophia found tears running down her face without quite knowing when they had started, and the nurse was talking into her phone with a voice that had started professionally brisk and was now barely holding itself together. And in all of that living, breathing, weeping, laughing chaos, Lily simply climbed up onto the side of the hospital bed, settled Conejo in the crook of her arm, and sat next to Marcus like she'd been doing it her whole life. The question everyone asked, of course, was what she had said. And for a long time, for weeks and then months and then stretching into a year, nobody knew. Lily would not say. Not because she was being coy or dramatic about it, but because when adults asked her, she would look at them with those dark, patient eyes and say, "I told him. It's his." As though the words belonged to Marcus now, and it would be wrong to take them back. As though a secret shared was a secret held, even when you were 3 years old, even when the entire world wanted to know. Marcus remembered fragments of those 47 days. Doctors had told Richard, and later Marcus himself, that patients in disorders of consciousness sometimes retained auditory processing, that the world outside was not entirely absent to them, filtered and strange and uninterpretable, like voices heard through deep water, but present in some form. Whether Marcus had been aware, in any meaningful sense during those weeks, was a question that the science could not fully answer, and that Marcus, characteristically, did not spend much time trying to. What he remembered with clarity was something closer to the end. A feeling more than a scene. The sensation of being very far away from something warm, not in terms of temperature, but in terms of presence. Light, in the way that light means not just visibility, but also warmth and aliveness, and the pull of everything that is still unfinished. And then a voice.
Small. Certain.
Not asking him to come back, not pleading or desperate, but simply saying a thing as if it were already true, and the truth of it reaching him in the dark like a hand. He tried, when he was asked, to describe what the voice had said. He could not quite find the words. It wasn't complicated, he said once, in an interview, the only interview he ever gave about any of this. It was the simplest thing. But when you're that far gone, when you're that close to just letting go of the rope, it's not complicated that you need. Complicated is everywhere. Complicated is why you might let go in the first place. He paused. She told me something was waiting for me, that it was mine and it was good, and I just had to come and get it. And then, the interviewer noted, he smiled, the particular smile of a man who has been given something he didn't earn and knows it and plans to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it. Lily, when she was older, 8, 9, old enough to have the conversation differently, but young enough to still be in possession of the truth, without it being complicated by self-awareness, explained it this way: I didn't really know what to say. So I just said what I would want someone to say to me if I was lost. Sophia heard her daughter say this, and went quietly to another room for a few minutes. In the months after Marcus woke up, the relationship between the Hale household and Sophia's small family shifted in ways that nobody had formally planned, but that felt, looking back, entirely inevitable. Richard Hale was not a man who made large, sentimental gestures easily. His emotional vocabulary had been built in a language of transactions and achievements and the measurement of value, and he was, at 52, genuinely working on a first draft of something different. But even he could not remain standing inside the old version of himself after what had happened. He set up an education trust for Lily on the morning of the 3rd day after Marcus woke up. He told Sophia about it over coffee, her first cup at the kitchen table with him, not across it, and he did not make a speech about it or surround it with language. He just told her what he had done and looked at her steadily and said, "It isn't enough. It isn't close to enough. but it's what I can do right now." Sophia had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Take care of your son. That's what's enough." Marcus's recovery was not instantaneous. Let no one tell this story as though love and mystery exist outside of effort and time, because they do not. There was physical therapy, brutal, slow, incremental, the kind of progress measured in centimeters that feels like mockery when you remember what running felt like. There were cognitive challenges that required patience from everyone in the room, including Marcus, who had been accustomed to his mind working quickly and fluidly and was now relearning certain pathways the way a stream reroutes around a fallen tree. There were bad days and better days and days that were simply days, which are their own kind of mercy. But Marcus came back. Not to exactly what he had been. That's not how it works, and this story will not lie to you about that. He came back to something that contained what he had been but was, in certain ways that mattered, wider. He had been to a place, wherever that place was, and returned, and it left him with a different relationship to time. A different understanding of what was urgent and what only felt urgent. He stopped being careful with his father. He stopped managing the distance between them like a border to be maintained. Richard, for his part, stopped going into the office on Sundays. It sounds like a small thing. For Richard Hale, it was the size of a continent. 5 years after the November, when Lily climbed onto the edge of a hospital bed and said 4 or 5 quiet words into the ear of a man she had never met, the world had not been remade. No miracles had been announced. Sophia still worked. Marcus still walked with a slight unevenness in his right leg, a permanent souvenir of the accident that he had made his peace with. Richard still made decisions that occasionally frustrated the people who loved him, because the truth is that people do not become entirely different people, even after the most extraordinary moments of their lives. They become more themselves sometimes, better versions if they do the work. But the world had changed in the smaller, more permanent way that actual change usually happens. Marcus had gone back to school. Not to the same program. He had shifted in the particular pivot of someone who has been forced to look at what they truly love from the outside, from architecture towards something adjacent, designing therapeutic and healing spaces. Hospital rooms, children's wards, recovery centers. Environments built around the idea that the space where you are sick or broken or lost is not a neutral space, that it matters enormously, that beauty and light and the feeling of being thought of can do work that medication alone cannot. He said when people asked why, that he'd had a lot of time to think about what a room could feel like from the inside. He and Lily had become, in the specific and unclassifiable way that sometimes happens across impossible distances of age and circumstance, something like friends. He was 29. She was 8. He called her the boss, which she found acceptable. He had taught her to play chess, which she had promptly become better at than him, which she found even more acceptable. When she came to the house on the Saturdays that Sophia worked, she would find him in the study with his drawings and sit across from him and do her homework, and they would work in companionable silence broken only by her occasional questions about geometry, which he answered without making her feel like she should already know. Once, when she was 7, she had asked him, "Do you remember when I woke you up?" He had looked up from his drawing and said, "Every day." She had thought about this, chewing the end of her pencil. "Are you glad?" He had set down his pencil entirely. He had looked at her with the complete seriousness that she, perhaps alone among the people in his life, reliably inspired in him.
"Lily," he said,
"Do you know what I was working on yesterday?"
She shook her head.
A design for a children's wing at a hospital in Raleigh. 30 beds. Big windows. A garden that the kids can see from every room, even if they can't go outside. He paused. There's a doctor there who's been trying to get this built for 12 years. Because she believes, and I believe it now too, that when you're sick and you're scared, what you can see from your window matters. That it's not a small thing. That it's maybe one of the most important things. Another pause. I wasn't going to get to do that. Someone else would have designed those windows, and maybe they would have been fine, and 30 sick kids would have looked out at them and gotten something good from them. But it wouldn't have been this. It wouldn't have been what I know now from the inside. Lily listened to all of this very carefully, the way she listened to things she was storing. So yes, Marcus said. I am glad. Richard Hale, at 57, was a different kind of billionaire than he had been at 52. Not a saint. He would have been irritated by that description, and it wouldn't have been accurate. He was still competitive, still driven, still occasionally maddening to work with. But the Hale Technologies Foundation had, in the 5 years since that November, quietly expanded its medical research funding into areas specifically targeting traumatic brain injury and consciousness disorders, the kinds of research that had no obvious commercial application, the kinds that the market did not naturally reward.
He was not quiet about this.
When asked in interviews, he said plainly that it was personal. He also, every Sunday evening without fail, put on Miles Davis in the study and stood at the window, looking at the garden. But now, sometimes, there were people with him when he did it. Sophia Reyes bought a house. It was a modest house, a good house, in a neighborhood where Lily could walk to school, and there was a park nearby, and the neighbors knew each other's names. Richard had made that possible, without making it a transaction, which had required him to practice a kind of giving he had never really learned before, the kind that does not keep a ledger. He was, by his own admission, still learning. Sophia was patient with the learning and honest when he got it wrong, which she considered both her right and her responsibility. Lily, at 8 years old, going on 800, still asked too many questions at maximum volume, still studied people and things with those dark, unhurried eyes, still arrived in any room as entirely, completely herself. She was the kind of child who other children followed, not because she was loud or aggressive, but because she seemed to already know something they were all trying to figure out. Her teachers described her as exceptional. Sophia tried not to let this go to either of their heads. On the 5th anniversary of the day she had walked into a room and whispered something into a stranger's ear, the Hale household did not mark the occasion with anything formal.
There was no ceremony.
Richard had thought about organizing something and Marcus had talked him out of it, and Marcus had been right. What happened instead was ordinary, which is to say it was everything. Sophia made dinner. Actual dinner, at the kitchen table, the big kitchen table that had always been too big, and now was the right size. Marcus came. Richard sat at the head, which he always did, but there was something different about it now, something that understood the table was not a throne but a place to eat with people you love. Lily ate 2 helpings and talked about her chess tournament and asked Richard 3 questions about how the stock market worked that he answered with increasing respect for the acuity of her mind, and then she announced that she was going to be either an architect or a diplomat. She hadn't decided. Marcus looked at her across the table and smiled. "You could be both," he said. She considered this. "That's true," she said. "I probably could." Outside, the November evening was doing what November evenings do, turning the garden golden for a last moment before the dark came down. The light came through the kitchen windows and lay across the table and across the faces of the people sitting there, and it was, in its quiet, unremarkable, utterly irreplaceable way, exactly enough. 5 years ago, a small girl had leaned close to a sleeping man and said something no one else could hear. She had told him something was waiting. She had been right. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget, drop your country in the comments. This story belongs to all of you. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what human beings are actually capable of. Before you go, I just want to say thank you for being part of this channel. If these stories bring you comfort, inspiration, or simply brighten your day, you can support the channel by clicking the thanks button below the video. Your support helps me continue creating more heartfelt stories for this wonderful community, and truly, every bit of support means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here.